This is East Asia Tonight.
Good Friday evening. I'm Muteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Japan's central bank hikes benchmark interest rates to a 17-year high, signaling more increases are on the horizon. Highlights from Japan's Prime Minister policy speech with a focus on survival and sustainability, while gearing up for tough talks with U.S. President Donald Trump to secure American presence. Donald Trump, meantime, says he would rather not impose tariffs on China, hinting a deal could be on the table. Meanwhile, Beijing emphasizes that there is enormous room for cooperation and no winners in trade wars. Also in East Asia tonight, American companies in China bracing for a year of worsening geopolitics. A survey shows more than half of them fear more policy uncertainty and trade disputes. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has delivered his policy address at the Ordinary Diet session today, in which he highlighted his policy initiatives and foreign policies. While leading a minority government, Mr. Ishiba is tasked with passing the country's largest ever national annual budget worth nearly $740 billion. Mitsubishi Ishida has this report.
In his speech at the Diet session, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba wants to ensure the survival and sustainability of the country, in which he placed emphasis on revitalizing the rural areas by attracting the youth, forging closer collaboration between the public and private sector, and promoting innovation and the use of high technology. He hopes the hosting of the World Expo in Osaka will inspire children for the future of Japan and deepen international exchanges. He stressed the alliance with the U.S. as the cornerstone of Japan's diplomacy. He did not specify when, but he was determined to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump soon to promote further cooperation in security and economy and to take the alliance to new heights. Mr. Ishiba's most important task is to pass the record-sized fiscal year 2025 budget. The budget includes social welfare and defense spending, which are the biggest ever. With Japan's already huge national debt, the largest opposition party, Constitutional Democrats, aims to reduce the spending while proposing free school lunches and better wages for caregivers. Mr. Ishiba aims to legislate the national budget based on democratic values with his coalition partner Komeito and support of opposition parties by the end of March. But analysts think he may have to give in to demands of opposition parties, for example, on the amount of taxable income, which could hit his expected tax income estimate. There are two major elections taking place this year in Japan, the Tokyo Assembly and the Upper House election. If Mr. Ishiba has trouble pushing through the budget, it might weaken his party further ahead of elections. Mitsubishi Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Well, the Japanese markets are also in focus today after the Bank of Japan hiked rates to their highest level since 2008. And our business correspondent Roland Lim is standing by here to break down all the implications of the BOJ decision. So, Roland, this was a widely expected move, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, Oteli. The policy rate now stands at 0.5% amid signs of sustained inflation. The Bank of Japan has raised its benchmark interest rates to 0.5%. That's a 17-year high, signaling confidence in Japan's economic recovery despite global uncertainties. The move, which brings rates to its highest since 2008, was driven by steady economic growth and a stronger inflation outlook. The 25 basis point increase comes as Japan's economy tracks the BOJ's expectations, with rising wages and inflation remaining above the 2% target. At a news conference today, the bank governor, Kazuo Ueda, cautioned that future rate hikes will depend on the economic impact of this increase. The BOJ revised its 2025 inflation forecast to 2.4%, reinforcing expectations for future rate hikes. The BOJ now expects GDP to grow at 1.1% this year. Despite concerns over potential market disruptions linked to Donald Trump's economic policies in the U.S., Ueda emphasized the global financial environment had stabilized and that the BOJ is closely monitoring the state of the Japanese economy. Following the bank's decision, the yen gained as much as 0.8% against the dollar. Meanwhile, though, Japan's Nikkei 225 index ending the day in the red. For more insights, we're now speaking with Sayuri Shirai. He is Professor of Economics at Keio University and a former board member of the Bank of Japan. Professor Shirai, good to have you with us. Governor Ueda suggests that there's still a long way to go in reaching a neutral rate, but we don't have any new information where that neutral rate should be. What's a range that's good for the economy, do you think?
It's very difficult to explain this, but Japan is facing very serious dilemma. If you look at the domestic economy, real consumption is stagnant, and capital spending, corporate spending is really not so much. So domestic demand is so weak. So this is why you can see Bank of Japan did not make any adjustment on real GDP. However, inflation is very high, about 3%, simply because of the cost push arising from yen's depreciation. So this is the reason why Bank of Japan took action, although they were never explicit. So we have a cost push inflation and the domestic demand is so weak. So it's very difficult for Bank of Japan to say how far they can raise interest rate.
Professor, it's also interesting to note that the board decision to raise rates was essentially 8-1, and there was one dissension by board member Toyoaki Nakamura, who is considered a dove. I'm curious to know, do you share his concern that global growth may slow and consumption may remain soft in Japan?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So we are very much worried about the impact of U.S. policies under Trump on the Japanese economy. In case that the U.S. is going to impose tariff on the Japanese product, we will have very serious, damages to the Japan's economic performance. But at the same time, I think the biggest concern for us is that super cheap Japanese yen. So like 18 years ago, inflation was very low and we were struggling to raise inflation. But now we have a very high inflation because of yen's depreciation. We never expected that yen will be this cheap. So we are worried if the U.S. will have a high inflation, Fed is not able to lower interest rate. So we have a huge interest rate differential, then yen might depreciate further. So that might really push up our inflation. So this is not very good. So I think Bank of Japan is very much worried about that.
The volatility of the yen hinges on the strength of the US dollar. The dollar is in a position of strength right now. So what's your outlook for the yen then? I mean, is it likely to weaken to 160 to the dollar?
Yeah, so May and July, yen against US dollar reached 160. At that time, Ministry of Finance intervened in the foreign exchange market several times. But, now US economy is quite strong and it's very inflationary. So probably there's a great risk here that yen might depreciate beyond 160. So, and then because the Japanese economy is so weak, how much BOJ can raise interest rate? There is a concern here. So, moving beyond 160 is one possibility.
Also, Professor, the upward revisions to inflation are mostly due to cost push factors, higher wages, cost of raw materials, etc. Is underlying inflation strong enough to hit 2%, you think?
Yeah, very good question. BOJ say, even though this time, mainly inflation picked up because of cost push, but they also keep saying underlying inflation is rising towards 2%. But they never clarify what it means by underlying inflation. To me, if I look at services inflation and other underlying inflation is very weak, below 2%. So I don't really see any improvement towards 2%. But BOJ keeps saying underlying inflation is improving. So I think this is one of the reasons why many people feel governor's press conference is really not clear. And what is the objective of BOJ's policy? It's not really clear enough.
Professor, Another headwind has to be tariffs threatened by Trump. That's still an unknown quantity. And Mr. Ueda has decided not to speculate on the scale of the tariffs, only to say that once there's clarity, it'll be reflected in policy. What's the worst case scenario or best case scenario for the BOJ to be prepared for?
Yes. So in the past, Japan was exporting to China quite a lot, about 20%. Now, U.S. is the biggest market for us. So about 20% of Japan's exports go to the United States. So, and the U.S. economy has been quite good over the past years. So I think if Mr. Trump will charge, say, 25% tariff also on Japan because U.S. is having trade deficit against Japan, I think this will be a quite disastrous impact. So, I think Japan will try to do every effort to prevent that kind of situation. Because Japanese economy in the past, like last year, from January to December, Japan's real GDP growth was nearly 0%. So if we will have a tariff from US, you can imagine our economy will be not very good.
So earlier you talked about how the yen is very cheap at the moment. So how much of an impact do you think this weaker yen will have on inflation through higher import prices and earnings for Japanese exporters?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So right now, Japan's inflation is around 3 to 3.6%. 85% of inflation comes from just food and energy. Okay, so energy is related to subsidies, so it's quite volatile. But I must say 50% of inflation comes from purely food. So you can imagine this is almost all coming from yen's depreciation. So you see how big the impact of yen's depreciation on Japan's inflations, depreciation on Japan's inflations.
Professor Sirai, despite the higher prices that we've discussed, are we at that level where corporates are now able to pass on the costs to consumers? Are consumers more confident these days in spending?
Over many years, the company tried to pass on this increased, input cost on production, on the sales prices very gradually. Because they are worried about the impact on the consumers, and consumption is stagnant over these 5-10 years. So it's very difficult to pass on. So they did it over a period. And still, many companies try to pass on this past yen's depreciation and the increased import cost on sales prices. So still, they are doing it. And then large company could do it, but many small and medium enterprises, they are telling me it's very difficult to pass on, simply because consumption is really weak. So it takes a lot of time.
Professor Sirai, thank you for explaining all the headwinds that the Japanese economy is facing. Professor Sirai of Economics at the Keio University, and former board member at the Bank of Japan. And I'll be back a little later on with more business news.
All right, we'll chat more then. Thanks, Roland. U.S. President Donald Trump says that he would rather not impose tariffs on China, saying that he thinks a trade deal could be reached instead. Well, since returning to the White House, he's threatened to hit Beijing with 10% tariffs. Now, the world's two largest economies have been sparring over a number of geopolitical and economic issues. Now, speaking to Fox News, Mr. Trump called tariffs a tremendous power over China, but said he would prefer not to use them. Beijing, in response to Trump's softening tone, denied pursuing a trade surplus with the U.S.
这个问题我们已经多次表明了立场，中美经贸合作是互利共赢的。我们认为，如果双方有分歧和摩擦，应当通过对话和协商来解决。贸易战、关税战没有赢家，不符合任何一方的利益，也不利于世界。
The Trump administration has proposed tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, and they are expected to come into effect from 1st of February. Well, the U.S. president also spoke to Chinese President Xi Jinping over the phone last week, prior to Mr. Trump's inauguration on Monday. The leaders discussed various issues, including TikTok, trade, and Taiwan. Mr. Xi also congratulated Mr. Trump on his second term and pushed for improved ties. President Trump earlier gave global business leaders and politicians an ultimatum, and that is to invest and make products in America or face the wrath of tariffs. Well, he shared his economic agenda in a virtual address to the World Economic Forum in Davos.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt.
Mr. Trump proposed a 15% corporate tax rate for companies manufacturing in the U.S., down from the current 21%. It would require approval from Congress. Well, he has already threatened to hike tariffs on Chinese goods by 10% and levy 25% taxes on Canadian and Mexican products, all as soon as February 1st. The risk such a move could trigger an all-out tariff war is worrying the World Trade Organization.
We've done the numbers. If we have tit-for-tat retaliation, whether it's 25%, tariff 60%, and we go to where we were in the 1930s, we're going to see double-digit global GDP losses. Double-digit. That's catastrophic. Everyone will pay. That's like losing the economy of Japan and Korea combined.
Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, China markets breathing a sigh of relief after Donald Trump says that his conversation with China's Xi Jinping had been very friendly. And LG Energy Solutions slashes spending as uncertainty lingers over global EV markets. The South Korean prosecutors have asked to extend the arrest of President Yoon Suk-yeol while they try to speed up investigations into his short-lived martial law decree last month. If the courts approve, authorities can hold Mr. Yoon until 7th of February, more time for prosecutors to interrogate the impeached president. But Mr. Yoon has so far refused questioning by the Corruption Investigation Office. He's currently held at the Seoul Detention Center. Law enforcement agencies believe he is the mastermind behind the martial law declaration in December, the start of the country's political crisis. Now, South Korea's constitutional court is also deliberating his impeachment. If the court rules against him, he will lose the presidency and elections must be held within 60 days. Now, a legal expert explains the impeached South Korean president's strategy as proceedings appear to be dragging on.
4월 중순이 되면은 현재의 헌법재판관 또 2인이 임기가 만료가 됩니다. 그런 임기가 만료가 되면은 헌법재판소가 다시 또 6인 체제로 들어가게 되기 때문에 6인 체제에서는 결정을 내릴 수가 없습니다. 이제 그런 것도 염두에 두고 있는 것이 아니냐. 그래서 가능한 한 기일을 많이 잡아서 그 기간을 자꾸 늘리려고 하는 것이 대통령의 입장이라고 볼 수가 있고, 변론 기일이 더 연장이 된다면 3월 초중반에 변론이 날 것이고, 3월 10일 전후로 해서 날 수 있을 것이고, 변론 기일 2번이 더 연장이 되지 않는다면, 그렇다면은 아마 2월 마지막 주 혹은 또 3월 첫째 주 정도로 마무리가 될 수도 있지 않을까, 그런 생각을 해봅니다.
Roland Lim is back with us once again. More questions for you, Roland. So tell us in a nutshell, how did the Chinese markets react to Donald Trump's words?
Well, Chinese investors really like the reduction in tensions with the U.S. Our Chinese and Hong Kong stocks today rising, buoyed by those comments by President Trump that his recent conversation with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping was friendly and that he could reach a trade deal with China. Investor sentiment also getting a lift from the policy measures announced yesterday to boost domestic stocks. Analysts say the initiative could inject at least $138 billion of additional flows into the equity market this year. The Greater China markets closed in the green, the Hang Seng Index clearly outperforming both the Shenzhen and Shanghai Composite. Currency yuan also strengthening against the greenback after the central bank moved to ensure liquidity in the system. Mitsubishi Motors is reportedly considering stepping away from a planned merger between Honda and Nissan. According to Japan's Yomiuri Daily, the smaller automaker has concerns about losing management autonomy due to its relatively small size. Remember, Mitsubishi is partly owned by Nissan, which holds a 24% stake. The company reportedly plans to remain listed and to focus on its existing partnerships. In a statement, Mitsubishi said it is still exploring options and no conclusion has been reached. Last year, Honda and Nissan agreed to formal merger talks, signing a memorandum of understanding to integrate under a holding company. The two automakers aim to conclude talks by June this year before setting up a company in August of 2026. The merger would create the world's third biggest auto group with an annual output of some 7.4 million vehicles. Shares of Mitsubishi, well, it plunged following the news, closing down almost 7%. Nissan dropped 3% and Honda fell around 1%. LG Energy Solutions says it will make major cuts to spending this year. This is as the company still expects a rebound in sales despite the uncertainties in the global EV sector. The South Korean firm will reduce capital expenditure by between 20% and 30%, according to a filing. The company recently posted a surprise $157 million loss for the final quarter of the year. Still, LG Energy expects to see sales increase 5% to 10% this year. The firm is banking on the new assembly lines at North American plants, jointly run by Honda and Stellantis. LG Energy is also hoping to sell more new products. The company supplies global giants such as General Motors, Tesla, and Volkswagen. Now, senior executives at Korea Zinc have offered to cooperate with the company's top shareholder and suitor a day after a stormy investor meeting where the metals giant sought to restrict voting rights. Young Pung and private equity firm MBK Partners hold some 41% of Korea Zinc. Now, they had sought to take control of the board with an investor meeting yesterday. Instead, Korea Zinc CEO Yoon Choi, well, he struck a last-minute share purchase deal that effectively barred the group from voting. Now, Korea Zinc President Park Ki-deok has been seeking to cool tensions by saying that they are leaving the door open to MBK, but the top shareholder reiterated that it planned to mount a legal challenge to Choi's maneuver. And that'll do it for business at this hour.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, American companies in China are bracing for a tough year ahead. What's behind the anxiety? Well, we'll be speaking to Michael Hart, president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, in just a short while. You're watching East Asia Tonight. Japanese leader Shigeru Ishiba, in his policy speech, touched on survival and sustainability while gearing up for tough talks with U.S. President Donald Trump to secure American presence. Also in Japan, its central bank hikes benchmark interest rates to a 17-year high, signaling more increases are on the horizon. And Donald Trump says he would rather not impose tariffs on China, hinting a deal could be on the table. Now, a new survey shows a growing number of American companies in China are worried about worsening bilateral ties. The American Chamber of Commerce in China asked nearly 400 U.S. companies, and more than half said that they believed China-U.S. relations will continue to go downhill this year. Well, that's the highest figure in the last 5 years. The anxiety, according to the report, is due to geopolitical tensions, policy uncertainties, and trade disputes. Well, the survey also shows more companies no longer see China as a high-priority investment destination. That's 21% this year, double the 10% before the COVID-19 pandemic. But nearly half the companies in the survey still see China as one of their top 3 global investment destinations, around the same level as last year. So let's go beyond the numbers. And for more insights, we are joined by Michael Hart, president of AmCham China. Thanks for joining us on this Friday evening. So first up, before we get into the report, I just want to get your reaction to Trump's latest softening stance on China, where he said he would rather not impose tariffs. Given his history of fluctuating positions, Michael, I'm curious to know, do you think this is something that U.S. firms are taking seriously or not?
So certainly U.S. firms are watching very carefully what Donald Trump is saying. And as you say, he can change his mind relatively quickly. One of the things he has said is that he hopes to come to China in 2025. And so if he is going to come visit China, we suspect, at least for the short term, he will probably be offering carrots and be more friendly. However, one of the things just a couple of days ago, the White House issued their America First trade policy. And they issued some directives, and they asked a couple of different government departments, including Treasury, Commerce, USTR, so the departments that usually look at international trade. And they've asked each of them to do an assessment and send some reports back by April 1st about where is the U.S. specific to China on trade balances and various policies and taxes. And so I don't actually think we're going to expect very much before April, once those reports are into the White House, so they can make an assessment.
Okay, good to know. April 1st, we'll keep that in mind. So I want to talk about AmCham's report, basically highlighting rising concerns over China-U.S. relations. So, Michael, what is the biggest worry for American businesses in China under the new Trump administration?
So one of the things that we ask is, do you have any suggestions for the U.S. government? And one of them was, please don't engage in tit-for-tat actions. So American companies are concerned that if the U.S. government takes action against a specific Chinese company, that a U.S. company in China may be punished in response. And so companies are very concerned. We have heard that the Trump administration has considered additional taxes and other things. We know the Chinese government is also putting together a list of what they would do, how they would react if the U.S. took action. And so U.S. companies who are operating in China, and it's an important market for many of our companies, they are concerned that they might become the target if the U.S. government and President Trump takes action against China or Chinese companies.
How different are these sentiments, though, compared to the first Trump administration?
So it's very interesting. I mean, China continues to be very important, but also continually more tricky. And so one of the things that we saw was President Trump put on tariffs and said that, the U.S. should be producing at home. The Chinese have become much more vocal that they want to do things at home as well. And so U.S. companies have increasingly seen in the last 4 or 5 years that the Chinese are often choosing Chinese companies instead of U.S. companies. And this could be, for example, in medical devices, mainframe computers, et cetera. And so U.S. companies are acutely aware that as the U.S. tries to produce more at home, the Chinese are trying to do the same thing. And so these are real concerns. If we take tech, for example, tech companies last year reported they were pretty profitable, but they've also reported that they're potentially going to be moving operations out of China in terms of manufacturing. And they know that the Chinese government is very suspicious of U.S. tech. And so, again, tech companies are right in the middle. They've been making good profits. They have good partners here, but they know the U.S. government doesn't want them to be selling too much to China. And they know the Chinese are trying to replace them at the same time.
Yeah, so it's interesting you've mentioned that because the companies see growth in the domestic consumption and reforms in China as key opportunities, as what you've mentioned, in sectors in R&D and tech and all of that. But then it also shows that there is weak demand and there is a rising tech war. So I'm curious to know, how do these opportunities line up with the current data?
Right. So if we look at the macro numbers, they're sort of mixed, right? So some companies say we're making a profit, but if you look at tech, there's a larger number of tech companies say they're making a profit than the average. If you look at potential for the domestic market to grow, of course, China's growing more slowly than it used to grow. So China used to grow at 8 to 12% a year, and now it's growing at 5%. But because of the size of the market, 5% growth is still pretty good, particularly if you already have a foothold here. However, where we're seeing companies not coming in, so companies who aren't here or those don't want to make additional investment because China is growing, again, more slowly than it used to grow, One of the things I would say is we're seeing companies who have made sort of a phase 1 investment in China and a phase 2 investment in China. What they're starting to tell us, instead of making a phase 3 investment in China, they may make that investment somewhere else. And the numbers play out that, companies who are here might make their next investment in somewhere else in Asia.
So in terms of how have they shifted the strategy? I mean, what's the biggest thing that has stood out?
Yeah, so companies are very concerned about profitability. They continue to say we want to be in this market, but increasingly, as you said, China for some of them is no longer a top 3 destination. So it's, again, a very mixed bag. And for a number of our companies, they definitely want to be in China. But what our business climate survey does say, for certain sectors, the consumer sentiment has impacted them. So, for example, if we take consumer companies, so think sort of retailers, coffee brands, et cetera, they were more optimistic 2 years ago when the economy had this post-COVID bump. But this past year, they really feel competition from domestic companies. And so they're a little less optimistic. If we look at healthcare companies, they continue to be optimistic about the market opportunities, but they also continue to be sensitive to the fact that in terms of government procurement, so selling, for example, to Chinese hospitals, that in some cases they're being pushed aside for preference for, Chinese hospitals buying from Chinese suppliers.
So for these growing number of firms that are thinking about relocating their production or procurement outside of China, there are challenges involved, I'm sure.
That's right. And so our surveys a year ago said 77% of companies said they are not considering moving out of China. This year was 67%. So a pretty big increase in companies who say they are now considering moving somewhere else. To your point exactly, the folks here need to remind headquarters at home that if you were to start operating, for example, in India or Indonesia or Malaysia, you probably are not going to have the same level of productivity or efficiency in a new factory that you would have in China, where you've been for 15, 20, 30 years. And so this is one of the advantages of China, is that it now has a very robust sourcing and manufacturing market. There are a lot of employees here. One of the things that other markets have is they can give incentives. China has increasingly been taking away incentives. They've been trying to say local governments are out of money, so they can't give tax subsidies like they used to give. And so if you're a U.S. company and you're in China now, it's an important market to be in. But if you do say going forward, if we want to support our supply chain, you might say we'll make the next investment somewhere else in Southeast Asia, in rare cases back in the U.S., but you do have to expect that those facilities will not be as productive as those that you've built in China and enjoyed for the last 15, 20 years.
So, Michael, do you have anything else to add on the outlook of the future trajectory of China's economy?
I mean, I think when we talk to the folks back in Washington, D.C. and with the Trump administration, and right now we're reaching out to engage with those folks, and we understand that China and the U.S. have very strategic differences. And in some cases, the U.S. wants companies to be wary of what kind of tech they're in the U.S. China is the world's second largest economy. And it seems that it would be a competitive disadvantage if American companies were to walk away from the market that is China, again, the second largest economy in the world, which continues to grow at 4 or 5% per year. And so we need to find a way to balance that, right? So how can U.S. companies continue to be active in this market and not lose the opportunity, but also, keep in mind the strategic and national security concerns that the White House has.
Appreciate your thoughtful insights. Thanks so much for speaking with us on this Friday. AmCham China President Michael Hart there speaking to us from Tianjin. President Trump earlier addressed the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war. He didn't deliver on his day one promise to end the conflict, but is saying now that lower oil prices could end the war immediately. Benji Haya helps us make sense of this all.
On oil sales, the reason why that's now the focus of Donald Trump's rhetoric is that
it is that is essentially the economic engine driving Russia's economy. And so Donald Trump wants to see oil prices fall in order to try to force President Vladimir Putin's country to the negotiating table. In terms of solving the war in Ukraine, yes, it hasn't been solved in a single day, but Donald Trump still wants to be seen as leading the charge here. He, of course, brands himself as a deal maker. He has mooted this idea of a settlement between Ukraine and Russia based on territory. He claims that that's what both sides want, and he has suggested that he will want to at least sit down with his counterpart in Moscow.
I really would like to be able to meet with President Putin soon and get that war ended. And that's not from the standpoint of economy or anything else. It's from the standpoint of millions of lives are being wasted. Hopefully China can help us stop the war with, in particular, Russia, Ukraine. And they have a great deal of power over that situation.
And he's calling on China to help because Beijing holds huge power and huge sway here. China, a key provider of products that sort of feed the Kremlin's war machine. President Xi also has the ability to lean on North Korea, try to encourage them to withdraw their troops from the battlefield or simply act as a mediator. Donald Trump also demanding again that NATO countries increase their defense spending. In fact, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte admitting that President Trump is being absolutely fair, he says, to demand that European allies do spend more, even though it will be a really tough ask for many member states. Russia, for what it's worth, well, it isn't responding with any particular urgency to Donald Trump's threat, that threat to impose sanctions if Russia doesn't agree to some sort of peace deal with Ukraine. The Kremlin reiterating that it is waiting for signals from Washington that it says has not yet been received.
Mr. Trump, meantime, says that he will reach out to Kim Jong-un again, calling the North Korean leader a smart guy.
He happens to be a smart guy. Kim Jong-un is a smart guy.
You'll reach out to him again.
I will, because Biden never asked Europe to spend.
Mr. Trump was speaking to Fox News when he said that Mr. Kim liked him. The two met 3 times during Mr. Trump's first term. And if you recall, the U.S. leader had said that they, quote, fell in love. Well, the two leaders' interactions in the past have put the U.S. at odds with South Korea. Mr. Trump recently called Pyongyang a nuclear power, which sparked fears in Seoul that the Trump administration could be legitimizing the North's nuclear weapons program. The South Korean Defense Ministry has since stressed that Pyongyang's status as a nuclear power cannot be recognized and that the denuclearization of North Korea must remain a goal for the U.S. and South Korea. Mr. Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, meantime, has backed a broader approach to ease tensions, calling for efforts between North Korea, South Korea and Japan to prevent conflict in the region, without encouraging anyone to pursue their own nuclear programs. The top U.S. diplomat said that Mr. Trump's first-term efforts had failed to produce any lasting agreement with Pyongyang. Pyongyang fired several short-range ballistic missiles just last week, days before Mr. Trump's inauguration. Before that, Mr. Kim also vowed to implement the toughest anti-U.S. policy to protect what he called North Korea's long-term national interests and security. South Korea's military says it suspects the North is preparing to send more troops to fight alongside Russian forces, despite suffering losses and seeing some of its soldiers captured. It's been 4 months since Pyongyang dispatched a first round of troops to help Moscow with its war against Ukraine. Ukrainian and Western officials estimate some 11,000 North Korean soldiers have been deployed to Russia's Kursk region so far. Kyiv says that more than 3,000 of them have either been killed or injured. Although Russia and North Korea initially dismissed reports about the troop deployment, President Vladimir Putin did not deny their presence in October. And a North Korean official has claimed that any such deployment would be lawful. Well, coming up on East Asia tonight, China's praised for doing an extraordinary job in tackling climate change.
Now, this particular boat landed on the resort island of Langkawi, northern parts of Peninsular Malaysia, in the wee hours early January. On board were almost 200 asylum seekers, believed to be ethnic Rohingyas. Many were women and children.
And a special report on changing attitudes towards a group of people the UN has called the world's largest stateless population. This is East Asia Tonight. We turn to Malaysia now, where refuge is crucial for Rohingya people escaping persecution in Myanmar. Well, their situation has become more precarious as the country has become less friendly towards Myanmar refugees. Authorities have turned away several boats ferrying asylum seekers in the waters of Langkawi this year. Melissa Go has all the details.
From far away, it looks like a fishing boat washed ashore on the scenic beach named Teluk Yu, which literally means Shark Bay, and now a tourist attraction.
Now, this particular boat landed on the resort island of Langkawi, northern parts of Peninsular Malaysia, in the wee hours early January. On board were almost 200 asylum seekers, believed to be ethnic Rohingyas. Many were women and children.
They hid on the lower deck of the boat that camouflaged as a fishing vessel. Clothes and leftover food were strewn all over front deck. All 192 people were arrested by the island police and handed over to the immigration department.
Setiap hari sebenarnya pasukan pengawasan kita mengesan bot mereka hampir setiap hari di perairan laut antarabangsa. Hampir setiap hari. Okay. Sekarang ni kita jaga. Kita tempatkan mereka di depo immigration, kita profilkan mereka. Itu atas tindakan kemanusiaan.
According to the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency, 2 more boats with more than 300 asylum seekers were turned away recently after they were given food and water. They were later reported to have landed near Aceh, Indonesia. Many among the local community felt uneasy about the presence of foreign vessels. There haven't been any boat landings, they said, in the last 4 years.
Tak boleh lah, tak suka lah. Mereka ambil hak kita juga, kan? Mereka ambil hak kita sebagai orang Malaysia lah. Macam hospital tentu, apa-apa sekolah pun mereka boleh masuk, mereka boleh buat, tak boleh. Tak adil lah macam tu.
As at the end of last year, the United Nations Refugees Agency, UNHCR, recorded almost 200,000 refugees and asylum seekers in Malaysia. Some 170,000 registered are from Myanmar, and the majority are Rohingyas.
Now, for decades, ethnic Rohingyas have faced persecution in Myanmar. Now, tens of thousands have fled Rakhine State on board a rickety boat like this across the Chopper Sea from the Bay of Bengal to reach Malaysia in a journey that could take up to 2 weeks.
Arfad fled Mongdo and came to Malaysia almost a decade ago. He now teaches at a community school funded by UNHCR on the island of Langkawi. The father of 2 said he's grateful to Malaysia for giving him and his family temporary refuge, despite not being a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees.
Here people is kind heart for temporary. We feel safe not for a long time, so we have been waiting for UN considerations for any resettlement, or if our country is peace, we need to return to our country, like a voluntary return.
But the situation seems to be getting worse back home, he said, with communications cut off by the army. He hopes that Malaysia's role as the ASEAN chair this year will help shine a spotlight on the plight of Rohingyas and stop the persecution. And at least 30 ASEAN meetings will be held on the island of Langkawi this year.
It's a crisis within crisis. On the one hand, there's a crisis of the coup and civil war that has to be resolved somehow, and ASEAN has a big role, leading role in that. But within that crisis, ASEAN also has to bear in mind the Rohingya crisis in Rakhine State, and to somehow deal with the Arakan army so that they tone down, they cease the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims.
With much of the world focusing on the Russia and Ukraine war, as well as the conflict in the Middle East, the Rohingyas hope that their plight will not be forgotten. Melissa Go, CNA, Langkawi.
Well, China's education ministry is ordering schools to step up science education in a move to boost innovation and economic growth. Schools have been told to implement a more comprehensive curriculum, improving teaching capabilities, as well as to better integrate education resources. School staffing will also be boosted to lead the change, and it is expected to eventually benefit its science and tech sectors, and it follows a separate call announced just days ago to build a leading country in education by 2035. Chinese President Xi Jinping said last year that his country would help foster an open environment for science and tech. It would also expand exchanges for international cooperation. This comes as officials look towards developing and supporting industries, both existing and new, to help create new drivers of growth. The chair of the next UN climate summit has praised China for doing an extraordinary job in tackling climate change and has lashed out at rich countries for trying to do less. Brazilian diplomat Andre Coro de Lago said that Beijing is giving infinitely more support to the developing world than providing symbolic amounts of aid. He accused rich countries of trying to cut back their financial contributions, which he said was deeply wrong. COP30 is taking place in the Amazon city of Belém later this year, and Brazil will be pushing for developed countries to do more to help developing countries switch to clean energy. Well, the COP30 chair also said without U.S. support, the clean energy transition will be a lot more difficult. Just days ago, U.S. President Donald Trump pulled his country out of the Paris Agreement a second time. He also doubled down on the use of fossil fuels. Well, dozens of newborn panda cubs in China have made their first public appearance. Well, just in time for the country's biggest holiday next week. The panda babies from 2 research centers in Sichuan province sent the Chinese New Year greetings over video link yesterday. All the cubs were born in 2024, and they helped themselves to traditional goodies: sticky rice balls, bamboo, and a very special treat, paintings made of sugar. Sichuan is home to the largest panda habitat in the world. Official data shows the wild giant panda population has grown from just over 1,000 in the 1980s to nearly 1,900 today. The number of pandas in captivity is about 750. And ahead on Asia tonight, we turn our attention to the broader Southeast Asia region, where some cities now are among the most polluted in the world. Swiss-based IQ ranked Ho Chi Minh as the second most polluted city, with Phnom Penh and Bangkok close behind. And Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto begins his 4-day visit to New Delhi, with security and technology high on the agenda. The Indonesian president will be the top guest at India's 76th Republic Day celebrations. And I will be speaking with our correspondent on that. These stories and more on Asia Tonight, 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. And that does it for East Asia Tonight this Friday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. And also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for your company. Have a great weekend.